The root of the problem in the sustainability crisis is a loss of the sacred. Through conversations with scientists, theologians, scholars, thought leaders, and friends of the Spirituality and Sustainability Global Network, Make It Sacred explores the intersectionality of spirituality and sustainability and why this intersection is critical at our existential societal tipping point. Without spiritual grounding, we won't have a commitment or political will to create hope for sustainability. Co-creation always starts with a conversation. And what are we co-creating? A spiritually grounded passion that comes from a sacred understanding of the earth. Hi, my name is Maddie, and I'll be your host as we start these conversations together. Hi everyone, today I'm really excited to bring you this conversation with my friend Brooke McDonough. She is a conservation photographer who is currently working on a grant with National Geographic on lawn culture in America, which, grass might sound like a boring topic, but it's actually fascinating, and you'll learn so much from her about the philosophy and the culture and the history and the ecological impacts kind of surrounding this whole issue. Brooke is so passionate about the work she does. She's enthusiastic, she's gregarious. It's really inspiring to see someone who is doing the work in the world that they love, and it's really inspiring as her friend, and I would like to believe as anyone listening to see how she has taken the passions and the talents that she has and put them to really good use in the world and in her life. We also talk about her work with David Liittschwager on insect decline and some of her other projects. One of my favorite parts of this episode is she really gives us tangible tools on how we can create a better environment for bees, for insects, for our children, for our pets, for ourselves in our yards. And it could be as simple as planting a flower to be able to feed several bees, or completely transforming your lawn into a hospitable environment for insects and for you. So if you would like to support this podcast with more than just your ears, you can click the link in the show notes to donate to further educational initiatives like this one from the SSGN. And you can also leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. It just helps this show to get out to more people. Okay, without further ado, let's learn from my friend Brooke.
I started doing this project with National Geographic and looking at lawn culture and looking, because I have come from a lot of insect side of things. I've done a lot of work with bees and things. So that's where I started looking at pesticide and herbicide use. But then on the flip side, I had also been doing all this work with Parkinson's because of my grandfather in that film. Mm-hmm. And it turns out there is like quite a link between Parkinson's and pesticide and herbicide use. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm working on moving forward on doing like another project, probably a film about that linkage. And it's quite an interesting time because the EPA, I don't know the exact details off the top of my head, but they're basically being called to like review some of the herbicides that have been approved because of their link to developing Parkinson's disease.
Wow. Yeah, that's really fascinating that you're studying all of these things, but then they're also...
Yeah, they both were just kind of personally of interest to me. And then it was kind of like a put your hands together. I like realized how they intersected.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
So why don't you start? Let's back up a little bit.
Yeah.
Start by telling us about kind of your upbringing and cultural background. I love asking that question because I like to know where people came from. Mm-hmm. I think it's really, your formative childhood years really impact what you care about and your values. So let's start with that.
Yeah, I grew up in Northern Virginia in Great Falls, which is a really beautiful area. It is right, like kind of adjacent to Great Falls. I think it's a national park. And so we were really immersed in nature and wildlife, which was cool. I was not hugely interested in nature and wildlife as a kid. I liked being out in the woods and things like that, but I think I took it for granted. My mom was super active and was always trying to get me to go on walks or hikes with her. And apparently, according to her, I used to say that I wasn't a fan of unnecessary walking.
Great line.
Yeah. She quotes it to me all the time now. But I think I took it for granted, just like the nature that was right at my doorstep. And I didn't really realize that other people didn't have that same kind of access to it and whatnot. But I was always really taught by my family to respect nature and wildlife and just value it, I think. It wasn't really until I got to college and I started thinking more deeply about what I was really interested in. I think up until that point, I was kind of just going with, the fad in high school or whatever, just kind of trying to get through school, to be honest. So when I got to college and I started trying to think like, what am I interested in? What might I want to do? That I did find like, oh, I think I have more of a passion for nature and wildlife than I knew, especially when I would hear something, I seemed to get really, really excited about it more so than others. And I was like, oh, maybe this is something. But I am not a scientifically oriented brain person. So I was not going to be a scientist or a biology major or anything.
You're a good communicator though.
Thanks.
Which I think essentially when you're doing photography, especially when you're doing documentary work, it is a lens through which you're communicating and highlighting a story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's how I kind of came to find that world of science communication or storytelling or whatever you want to call it, because I was majoring in English literature, because I did when I was a kid. I loved reading. I was obsessed with reading, and I still am.
Yeah,
to this
too.
day, I read fanatically. It's a little problematic. Spend all my money on books. But so I thought maybe, go into publishing or something. I just love books. And I took a social issues in literature class, which I thought was going to be, kind of looking at race issues, housing crisis, anything like that, like social issues. But my professor happened to be focused on environmental issues in his research. And so we ended up reading a lot of climate fiction, which I didn't even know really existed before. And my favorite one of that class, which I have reread a number of times, is called Flight Behavior by Barbara Kingsolver. It's a beautiful novel.
Oh, what else has she written? Why do I know that name?
Probably the Poisonwood Bible.
Okay.
You might know. And then she just came out with another one called Unsheltered.
Okay.
That I think is really popular right now. She's written a lot and she's a really prolific writer. But I loved that book. It really deals with climate change in kind of a personal narrative way that I found really interesting. And that was kind of like an aha moment for me to be like, oh, you can work in climate change or environmental issues or whatever and not be a scientist. It never really clicked to me that you could have that. Obviously those career paths needed other, or those industries rather, needed other roles besides just scientific. And so then I kind of started to look into that more deeply. But it was really, in an English class.
That's cool. And I would argue too that those artistic roles in communicating needs are really, really important right now too, because there's a huge difference. Obviously, science is so important and, we need to know facts and hard data, but there's a huge difference that happens in the human heart when you hear, oh, this is a statistic versus here's a story. We remember those.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think so much of change is backed by data, but doesn't necessarily come from data that's coming from scientific research. It comes from groups of people, calling for change or asking for change or putting pressure on some sort of system. And in my experience, I'm obviously a little biased because I tell stories, but I think creating that connection through a story is a much stronger way than just showing facts and figures.
So I know you've done a lot of interesting projects, and I want to talk about a lot of them, but the one that we kind of had to stop ourselves from talking about before I started the recording is your work with National Geographic and the lawn project that you're doing, which is near and dear to my heart. And it really excites me. And I'm really excited to see what you do with that because I think it's just wonderful. But can you tell us, okay, first, how did you start to work with National Geographic? And what is that project? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So my official capacity with this project in National Geographic, I'm known as a National Geographic Explorer, which
Okay.
means that my work is funded by them. I have a grant from their nonprofit arm to work on this project. And I just applied for it and I got the grant. I had first worked with National Geographic through another grant called the Second Assistant Program, which basically people in the organization nominate photographers who are underrepresented, so women or minorities. And they're kind of the people who are nominated are typically early career, but have some potential. And I was nominated for that program and I was eventually selected, which means I was matched with a like a big time National Geographic photographer who was doing an assignment for the magazine, which did end up being the cover story. And I believe it was in May of 2020.
What was that story?
It was on insect decline in the United States. And so the photographer I worked with, his name is David Liittschwager. He is a truly amazing photographer. I really love his work. So they funded me I worked with him for about 2 weeks. We did prep. I worked with him in the field. I did post-production. We met up with some scientists in the Great Smoky Mountains who were doing insect surveys. And we did this very highly specialized type of photography that David specializes in. And he taught me all of that. That was really my first experience on how do you manage a story that large? How do you visualize this type of decline? Like, how do you photograph decline? That's a very challenging thing to do.
How did you do that?
The biggest way was photographing these scientists. And it was David mostly photographing them. I carried gear around and whatnot, but I was still honored to help, who were recreating studies and comparing the decline. So we had those statistics. And then what David is known for is this photographing things on this white background. And basically, it's really highly detailed macro photographs of these insects on a white background. And the magazine ended up using, I don't know, maybe 30, probably more, probably closer to 50 of those images kind of composited into one. It looked like one photo, but it was all these images that he had made from all over the world. He went to more places without me. I just wasn't able to go to all of them and looked at all this different research on how insects were declining. And interestingly enough, the article was written by Elizabeth Colbert, or Colbert, I don't know how you say it, who was a really amazing environmental journalist who I first read in my literature class. It was a very exciting moment for me. But that kind of directly, I was working on a bee project, which I think is why I got selected for an insect to assist on an insect story. And then I was looking at this insect story. I read all the research that David had been studying and whatnot. And I just was looking around and I was like, okay, there's so much insect decline happening. And the biggest factor that I see coming up again and again isn't really, you hear about chemicals and things, which are obviously important, but it's land change is a huge part of it. And you'd think that would be like urbanization in cities, but actually, interestingly enough, cities use land really thoughtfully because they don't have that much land. Whereas you go into like the suburbs, land isn't really used as thoughtfully because there's so much more of it. And so lawns and roadsides and things like that are really problematic because they're this huge swath of land that isn't being used correctly. And that's when I was like, oh, in my world, no one was talking about it. Now that I've looked, other people are, but it's still kind of like a growing movement. And I was like, I bet you so many people don't even know about this because I didn't. I grew up with this huge front lawn. We ran around in it, didn't think anything of it. It was just what you do, right? That's part of culture. So I wanted to look at this lawn culture. And because once I started researching it, it is really ingrained in the culture of, perfect American dream, like 2.5 kids, white picket fence, perfectly mowed lawn type world. And so I kind of sprungboard from that second assistant program and applied for the grant, which I think really helped me be selected as a National Geographic Explorer.
So when you're talking about lawn culture, Where did that start? Where did that originate? When did we start having these manicured lawns and using pesticides and insecticides? Where did that stem from?
Okay, there's a fascinating book that if anyone is interested in this, you should read. It's called The Lawn, A History of American Obsession. And it kind of goes into the whole history of this, but it basically came from like the founding fathers. So culture didn't travel as quickly as it does now because we didn't have the internet or even airplanes. So basically, there was one man who was traveling the most from Europe to the United States at that time, and it was Thomas Jefferson. And he came from France because he was, working with the French at the time. And he came back after the Revolution. And in Europe, all around, primarily, I think England, but in a lot of places in Europe, lawns were very common. But think about the temperature, particularly in England. It's a very different climate.
And it's very, very wet too.
It's very wet. Yeah. Very different than a lot of the places in the US, including Virginia, where Thomas Jefferson lived. So Thomas Jefferson made Monticello. The lawn at UVA is very famous.
Even CNU, our school was
modeled after
Jeffersonian architecture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. And so Jefferson was kind of the first one that we point to for doing that, who did that. And then George Washington kind of replicated it in, what is the name of his house? It's in Alexandria. I actually just photographed her wedding there. I'm going to look it up.
I don't know. George Washington, fun fact, is actually my cousin.
I feel like I knew that. That's so cool. Washington House, Mount Vernon. There we go.
Oh, yeah.
So George Washington copied it in Mount Vernon. And then there is kind of like a long and storied history of the lawn, but it also started becoming more fashionable because very wealthy people in America were traveling by train. This is well after the founding fathers, of course, but they wanted their views of the countryside to be more beautiful while they were traveling by train. So that was kind of an aspect of it. And then again, all of this information is in the book. So if you fact check me and I'm wrong, this is just from my memory, but
I'm not going to.
Yeah. I believe
maybe someone has read it that's listening.
Yeah. I believe it was the Department of Agriculture when it was formed. They hired some guys and they were really in love with golf. And so they diverted a ton of this department's money into developing turf grass, because that's not native to the United States, which is grass that will grow really well in our different ecosystems. Because again, like you said, it's much more wet in England. It's just very different climate. And so they put tons of the US government money into developing this grass that would grow really well. And then there's like a lot of history on how lawn care industry developed and kind of started marketing and making us feel like we needed something that no one was asking for, just like lawn mowers and all that kind of stuff. So it's a very interesting chart through our American history.
Even when you say, I never thought about like it starting with the founding fathers, but even when you say that, it makes a lot of sense because George Washington was a surveyor and Thomas Jefferson was very big into agriculture. And even in the colonial settlements like Williamsburg, they were very focused on maybe not the lawn, but the garden. Super manicured, super uniform. That probably comes from English gardens.
I think it does. And there is some history in lawns as well, where during World War II, like victory gardens were becoming a big thing. And that kind of translated into lawns. And there's another book that I've only just started, but it's called Lawn People. And it looks at how different industries in the United States have shaped our perception of things through land, and lawn is like a big one of them. Conformity, right? Making people conform through lawns. It can get really deep.
Yeah. It's very, you could approach this from so many angles, philosophically, environmentally, historically. What impact does this lawn culture have on wildlife ecosystems? Because you have a lot of, that's why you got into this, looking at insects.
Yeah. So it has a massive impact because it's about 40 million acres of land that make up the lawns in the United States.
And in proportion, do you know, like what percentage of the land in the US that is? I know that's kind of a specific question.
I don't know the percentage, but I do know it's like roughly 3 times more land than corn takes up and or any other irrigated crop. So yeah, I don't have percentage wise, but it's like a huge part of the land. And it also is considered a monoculture. So there's about 91,000 described insect species in the United States, and they all need like a diverse nutrient base like we do, right? As people, we can't just eat one thing. We have to eat a variety of things. And irrigated crops are like this too. If there's just rows and rows of one crop, that's not good for insects as well. They need more different types of nutrition and things like that. But
or the land.
Yeah, it's not good for the land either. And for a while, I was calling this project the root of the problem, right? Like it's coming from the land and it's working its way up. And so, yeah, the monoculture is problematic for the insects. And grass itself is this type of turf grass. There are other grasses, but this type of turf grass has no nutritional value for insects, really. It doesn't have any blooms. It has no pollen or nectar or anything like that. So when you look at these species whose populations are plummeting, just from habitat and nutrition alone, that's just massive area of land that's not being used well. And then on top of that, there's pesticide use or herbicide use. So things like Roundup is the main one I can think of, but different things to kill off the weeds and just keep the grass. In US, we roughly use 78 million pounds of pesticides annually, just in lawns, not in agriculture, which is a disturbing amount. And homeowners tend to use like 10 times more chemical pesticides per acre of their lawns than farmers do. Yeah, so it's really one of those things, because I really love to work on projects where I don't want to just tell doom and gloom, although it sounds like I am right now. I want to have hope and have change and like have people feel empowered to make change. And this is something that can really start to change on an individual basis. And so that was something that was really important to me, was looking at a project that we actually do have the power to start changing, because it doesn't these are huge numbers and it doesn't seem like one lawn might make all the difference, but it's also just about like a change in perception. Because there's also, I was talking about conformity. There's a lot of rules around like HOAs about what kind of plants and how you have to look like neat and tidy, but there's not really like a definition of what unkempt means, even though you can report your neighbor to the police in many places for having an unkempt yard.
That happened to my family.
That happened to your family?
Yeah.
Oh no. Did they make you change it?
I think it was grass was too long issue.
Uh-oh. Yeah, see, why is that a big deal? Why? So it's also starting to get like a change in perception of what is aesthetically pleasing. So
yeah, I want to talk about that more with you. I couldn't help thinking as you were talking about sort of the irony of you doing this now. And the college we went to they were so obsessive about lawns that, and this isn't a joke, they would spray paint brown grass green.
Mm-hmm. It was insane. I actually went back to that college in January, so only like 2 months ago. I don't know how to count months, a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
And I actually spoke in the class that I took, that literature class that I took, that got me interested in environmental issues, which was really fun and exciting for me. And immediately the students were like, well, I'm just thinking of the Great Lawn. And I was like, I know. And we had this really interesting conversation about how they could make change, even though they themselves don't have their own lawn.
Yeah. So what are some of those, what did you tell those students, but also what can someone do? Say someone lives in a suburb in some city in America and they have a standard lawn. What are those changes that individuals can make? Let's start with the students, someone that doesn't own property, but then.
Yeah. So someone who doesn't own property, I lived in a high rise for many years while I was working on this. There's a variety of things. I mean, obviously you can just inform people who do have lawns, right? Like I'm consistently calling my grandparents and trying to get them to change, or telling people about this. You can also use, like, I currently live in a house where I don't really have a yard that I can garden in, but I have like a front porch and I can put flowers there, which would provide pollen and nectar. And it only takes 5 flowers to support 1 bee, for example. So it's really not that much. If I had like a plant that had like 10 blooms on it that would support at least 2 bees. And then there's things you can look at in terms of how you spend your money. So for example, there's like bee-friendly beef that's kind of coming out now. And that has to do with, that's looking more at the agriculture side than like the American lawn side, but that has to do with how and when beef or cattle are being moved and things like that.
So is that more like regenerative
Yeah.
ranching?
Yeah, things like that. I don't know it like super well, but I'm working with a group. It's called Virginia Working Landscapes.
Okay.
And they're working a lot on that project. And my project is primarily it is only looking at the mid-Atlantic region. I have hopes to look, more west with water issues and things like that. But for this kind of initial piece of it, just to make it like feasible for me to actually complete, I'm just looking at this region of the United States. So they're doing really interesting work. There's also like bird-friendly coffee that you can get, which also has to do with like how the agriculture is working on the land, and things like that. So, and like I would say, because I know it's really hard to do, it feels like you have to research like everything you do, but organizations like Audubon Society and National Wildlife Federation are 2 really great ones that tend to have local chapters that will give you, like they have those resources available.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking of this as you're talking, there are native plant societies that have local chapters too.
Yeah. So that kind of gets to like what can a landowner do, someone with a traditional lawn, and it depends on how extreme you want to go. Even if you just converted a really small patch of lawn to flowers, that will help tremendously. You could go.
Do the type of flowers matter? Does it need to be native?
That's a great question. It is better to be native and native to the region you live in, right? So someone in California is going to have different than us here in Virginia. And that's where you would get like native plant societies would have really awesome resources on that. Same with Audubon. They're really great resources. But as long as they're like, in my opinion, sometimes native plant societies can get a little bit all or nothing in terms of things being native. My opinion, any kind of diversity is going to be better than the monoculture we currently have. There are some cases where like ornamental flowers aren't going to have pollen at all. But again, if you can just find some native plants in your region, and there are really beautiful ones, and they'll thrive more easily because they're like meant to live in this climate. And then you can go as far as you want, right? Like you could convert your entire land, depending on how much it is, to wildflowers or native plants, or you could, a very popular thing right now is clover yards instead of lawn, because it's short, right? You don't have to worry about like mowing it quite as frequently. And it still looks kind of neat and tidy, but it has those blooms, which really helps insect populations. And I think they look so pretty.
Yeah. And clover feels so lovely and soft to walk on, and it smells good.
I also know some people who are doing moss areas of their yard, which aren't as necessarily beneficial to like a bee, for example. But in terms of the land itself, that really helps, like acts like a sponge, and it's just really helpful to the land. And again, they're just doing like a small portion of their yard. And I think the rest of it is mulch, because they actually just don't have enough sun in their yard to grow grass either. So there's definitely ways that it can be a smaller change. It doesn't have to be like rip up your whole yard right now.
And I would assume too, maybe not even changing your yard, but just stopping the use of pesticides is also huge.
Yes, that's a great point. That's huge, just stopping the use and letting it grow naturally. You might have some more weeds, or if you water less, you might have some more brown spots or something. But I mean, that's kind of how that, again, kind of goes to changing the aesthetic. You can also just mow less frequently. That will allow weeds to grow some more. And many of those weeds are also, it's only weed by our definition. Many of them are not really weeds. And then, in general, it can save a lot of money in terms of, I mean, lawn maintenance is like $40 billion a year industry in the US. So it saves money on mowers or landscaping, certainly on watering and all that kind of stuff. So crazy.
I want to touch too on, so we were talking before the recording started, just kind of anecdotally, how your mom had a dog that got a disease that was linked to pesticide use really young. and died after spending a lot of time on a lawn, which we don't know for sure.
Right.
But I think it's important to talk about the health implications, not just, I mean, obviously our health is a part of the environment, but how that directly impacts, young children that are running around barefoot on the lawn, or your pets, or even if you're not walking on the lawn, breathing.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that you've also done work with Parkinson's, documenting the story of your grandfather. Can you kind of paint that picture and tie that link for us between, the lawn culture and pesticide use and just sort of what's so ingrained into us as normal and fine as Americans, but then the health implications?
Yeah. So like you said, I produced a film with the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research about my grandfather and his experience as a veteran with Parkinson's. So that was really just like a personal project that I'm really close to my grandpa. I lived with him for like a year when I was in grad school. So I just was really passionate about it. And I didn't really think of it connected to kind of my nature, conservation, wildlife in any way. I just thought this was an important story to tell as well. But the more I looked into it, you're right, there are a lot of health factors that are beginning to be linked to pesticide and herbicide use. And I had found that Parkinson's is one of them. And because it's just really random that I happen to be working on these two different things that I seemingly thought were not connected, but it turns out they are quite deeply intertwined. And what's looking like happens is that the pesticide or herbicide chemicals get into the water system, particularly in the Corn Belt of the United States, where there is like really high agriculture use. And I think this is just my opinion, not scientific research. I think that's because pesticide use in agriculture tends to be sprayed like a large amount at one time, where in lawns, it's like happening smaller amounts over the course of a year. But again, that's just my guess. Who knows if I'm right? But it gets into the water system, and then that can impact Parkinson's, as well as I've heard, autism, ADHD, like I think getting strokes. There's so many, the list can go on and on. I just happen to have this connection and a deep knowledge at this point about Parkinson's disease.
Quick question before you continue. So are those heavy metals? Because you hear like heavy metals causing
I actually don't know.
Autoimmune and autism and that kind of stuff. Are there heavy metals, and I guess there are a lot of components to pesticides. I don't really know the science of pesticides and what is in them, but are there heavy metals in those chemicals?
I'm looking it up because I actually don't know. That's a really good question. Okay, heavy metals arise from many sources, such as industry, mining, and agriculture. In terms of the sources in the agriculture section, they can be categorized as fertilization, pesticide, livestock manure, and wastewater. So yeah,
okay.
They are considered to have heavy metals in them, which is a great point that I actually didn't put together. Yeah, it just really can be detrimental for health. And for a while, I've wanted to do another project looking at this link between, and I think I'm going to primarily look at Parkinson's and pesticides and herbicides, again, because of my personal connection, but also just because of the audience that I would like to reach with this type of work. I think will connect more deeply with Parkinson's than they might with some of these other diagnoses. Like, for example, I have ADHD, and I know a lot of people don't consider that to be real, which I would beg to differ. But in terms of reaching an audience, like, I don't want to be arguing that the disease is real or not. I just want to make the point that I want to make. So yeah, I'm working on it right now. I'm in very, very early stages of another film that will look at that. And it's a really critical time in terms of policy, because the EPA is being called to look at some of the herbicides that are approved to be used right now and kind of reconsider or reevaluate if they're safe for us. It's kind of really getting into like a Silent Spring moment again with Rachel Carson.
Why is it that these things aren't regulated very much?
Well, I believe it is because the agriculture and pesticide business is huge and has a lot of money. And I think they're pushing their agenda through in Washington, D.C.
So like lobbying, I guess also there's a lot of government subsidies.
Yeah, things like that. Yeah, and I think that research is kind of slow on it. It's hard. It's really hard to make that kind of a link particularly with something like Parkinson's, which is an extremely difficult disease to study. You
Yeah.
can't even diagnose Parkinson's like fully officially until after someone's passed away, because you have to look at their brain. So
It's just based on symptoms.
yeah, and then they kind of have you take the medicine, and if it works, they're like, okay, it's Parkinson's, and we'll keep working on this medicine. But if it doesn't work, they're like, maybe it's not Parkinson's. So I think it's a combination of, yeah, like the lobbying and like deep pockets of that industry, and just science trying to do important research, and it's hard to do and make those links and get it all through.
So you said you specifically want to focus on Parkinson's because of the audience that you want to reach. What is that audience that you want to reach?
I think it's like, how would I define them? I think I would kind of define that audience that I want to reach as like a general American who lives in middle class, probably who lives in the suburbs and things like that, who would care about this issue, but probably doesn't have the time or resources or even like awareness that they need to look into this issue or even know that it's a problem. Because a lot of these things, that's kind of the audience that I would fall in. And I just had no idea until I started looking. And so people don't even know where to look. And then once you look, it's like, okay, well, what do we even do about this? So that's something else I try to do a lot in my work, is kind of pair these stories with action. So in lawn culture, it's, planting native plants. In this one, it'll probably be like more of a political action, like I'm not 100% sure what it'll be yet. I'm working with some advocacy partners, but it might be, signing a petition or calling a senator or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's hugely important because a lot of times, unfortunately, conservation can be very political.
Yeah.
And so when people hear that word that maybe don't fall in line with a certain political ideology, they dismiss it as not something they should care about.
You're right. It has become very politicized and looked at as very liberal. And I think a lot of people who are more right-leaning do care about this and would care about Parkinson's and like what pesticides are doing to their health, but it comes at them from a very political lens and also kind of a really blame focused lens. And so that's a big part of the reason that I'm looking at that side of an audience that probably is more right leaning, and what is my story that can educate them on just the facts. I am trying to kind of sway them towards my opinion, but my opinion is backed up by this research. And I'm really not trying to blame, like, this is an issue that's happening on both sides of the political line in terms of lawns and things like that. But I think that a story targeting those types of people needs to be done really thoughtfully, but I think they do really care and want to change.
Yeah, even thinking about my grandmother or my grandparents who care so much about this, we're very conservative. But I think that was kind of maybe before politics was as, I guess politics has always been polarizing, but now I feel it's more so with the nature of media.
Yeah.
And I really love what you said, though, because you're right. Blame is very discouraging and disempowering, and it makes you want to kind of hide away and not do anything. And it's depressing. Not to say that, someone that does something wrong shouldn't be blamed for it, but educating someone and inspiring and empowering them and giving them hope of, here's a problem, but you can do something about it. Especially with lawns, there's so many tangible things that you can take action on. On a very tiny scale, like you said, or going all the way and really, making a natural landscape in your home or on your former lawn. Like, that's really empowering and exciting.
Yeah. And I think, my grandparents were also conservative. And then, yes, as the media landscape has changed, I think it's changed some of their views on things, but it can be really empowering. And frankly, when environmental issues like this, I don't really think there are individuals to blame in terms of like the general public. It's so complex, and so much of it goes back to like huge corporations. So I do really try to come at things from more of an education and inspiring point of view, because, yeah, like you said, blame blame just makes you defensive. And then I don't really want to listen to what you have to say. And it's so cool, right? Like when I started looking at insects and like bees and learning about them and all the different colors they come in, and some are fuzzy and some are metallic and things like that, you can plant things and they will come to your yard and then you can just look at them. And it's like it's literally like a whole world has opened up to you. And it's just like beautiful and fun.
Yeah, it's magical.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about what?
It's sacred.
Yeah. I'm thinking about all the time I spent at my grandparent, and I grew up with, a lawn like that too, but especially at my grandparents' house in their later years when they could not maintain it, like the cable guy would come over and say it looked like Jurassic Park, but it was this incredible, gorgeous lawn with hummingbirds and butterflies and such species diversity, plants, insects, animals. Thought it was just like a paradise as a kid. And
it's amazing.
Yeah, it's truly, even just thinking of your children and raising them. And I think life, the way kids grow up now, is really different than probably how we grew up. Like my fondest memories of being a kid were playing outside and running around and exploring and, climbing the bayberry bushes. And so my parents were really into native plants too. But part of having that enriching outdoor education as a child is having more than just green grass on your lawn to explore in.
Yeah. And my mom and I had a really interesting conversation when I first started looking at this, because she said, well, I wanted some grass for you as kids because I didn't want to worry about ticks, which like is fair. Although I was getting into the woods anyways. So she had to do tick checks either way. Yeah. But that was where I also said, okay, it doesn't have to be your whole lawn. It can just be like a part of it. And then you can have that whole like exploration and just really amazing things. And also a place for my brother to kick the soccer ball or whatever and not have to worry about us getting ticks.
Yeah. I feel like I've repeated this fact so many times on this podcast at this point that people are, if they listen to it, are annoyed. But I heard this really interesting fact about ticks and Lyme disease from my doctor, actually. She's like a Lyme disease doctor. And someone asked her in an interview why there was such an explosion of Lyme's disease. Because if you think about it, people have always lived in nature. Suddenly we're just having this explosion of it. And she said that a big part of it has been the animals that carry ticks, like mice and rats, used to be held more in check by foxes and predators of that size. Mm-hmm. And so now that we have suburbs and American lawn culture, really, we don't have as many predators of the animals that carry the ticks. And so the disease runs a lot more rampant because it's not held in check by that natural, kind of food chain.
Yeah, that's crazy. And I was thinking when we were talking about like the explosion of wildlife that can happen in your yard, that's what I kind of was trying to get at when I said the root of the problem, like it starts from the ground up. Mm-hmm. There are houses that I work with and photograph, their native yards, who have foxes much more than just a lawn, because it also gives coverage to hide in and do their hunting and things like that. Bats are another one that get mosquitoes. Oh, that's not ticks.
But still, mosquitoes carry things
yeah,
too.
mosquitoes like we also don't want. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I never even thought of that.
Yeah, because just thinking about, we don't understand even sort of, I mean, not that this is a bad thing. It's amazing that we have medicine, we can take a pill. But I think we've kind of become really disconnected from thinking about our bodies, the environment, as a system and not as an isolated thing that we can change one thing and the rest stays in sync. Mm-hmm. Like you can't just interrupt one portion of an ecosystem or one portion of your body without having some downstream effect that might be negative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Kind of illustrated with the Lyme's disease things, but also like, most medications, if you take them, and I'm a really sensitive person. So if I take a medication, I'm going to have a side effect. Sometimes a really bizarre one that you would never think of, but it just makes you realize like, oh, our body is not sort of like a machine. You can't really isolate things. If you do something, taking a medicine is important and good if you need it, but you have to be aware that you can't just change one thing without it affecting everything else.
Yeah. And that's the exact same. Our ecosystems and our bodies are very similar in that sense. And that's that's just kind of we live in the Anthropocene, right? Like humans are having the most impact on our land. And we are kind of starting to see the effects of that, some
Yeah.
positive and some negative.
Yeah. And our bodies are part of the ecosystem
Hmm.
too.
Yeah. Like we are animals at the end of the day. We always
Yeah.
forget.
What's something that gives you hope?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm trying to pick one.
You can say multiple if you want.
Okay.
There's no rules.
Well, honestly, I mean, this sounds really cheesy, but seeing like a garden that has just like a huge, especially right now in spring, like a huge plethora of flowers. And then just like I will stand, and if you like relax your eyes, you just start seeing like all the movement happening around the flowers. Like obviously you can see butterflies, but like little insects and bees and things like that. Just like so much life that wants to thrive. That makes me really hopeful. And then seeing people get excited about that. Really, honestly, seeing people get excited about anything that they are passionate about is like my favorite thing in the whole world.
You're a good example of that because you're really enthusiastic talking about this stuff. You always have been.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm quite an intense person, which I think has been good in my work, especially because it's like a very self-motivated career.
Mhm.
And it makes me really excited about things. Yeah, I think that's probably my favorite thing. And it literally could be like a reality TV show. It doesn't have to necessarily be something like super profound, but just seeing like unfiltered joy and excitement is so special.
Yeah, I agree. Where do you want to take when you think about the future and the projects you want to do and the things you want to photograph and the things you want to study? What do you see there?
Ooh. Well, I have like a couple of different paths of interest within this like overarching thing that I find really interesting. Obviously, I talk about bees quite a bit. I have made in the past a 15-minute documentary about bees, and I'm just like obsessed with them, particularly native bees in the United States.
Mhm.
And there's a lot more in the world of bees that I would love to look at, kind of around the world. But I really typically try to work fairly locally. I think that's local journalism is really important. And then I do really want to expand this law and culture story to look at the United States broadly, because in different ecosystems, it has such a different impact. And then I don't know if I necessarily have like specific topics or stories I want to tell as I move down in my career or up in my career, hopefully up. But I just want to keep working on stories that can make an impact and have like a fairly tangible action with it, like we talked about earlier.
Mhm.
And my hope is just that as I get stronger and more connected in the conservation world, that I just like am able to help people have a larger and larger impact.